Hi guys! Today we're going to start something a little different than the normal stories we read. Because the normal stories we read are stories or fiction. They're usually stories that someone has thought of and created. But today's book is called Little Leaders, Old Women in Black History by Vashti Harrison. And these are little mini biographies, which are kind of little historical stories about real people to tell you a little bit about them. And there are quite a few very bold leaders and women in here, too many to do in one time. So we're going to read the whole book, but we're going to break them up, okay? So today we're going to start the book with a little introduction from the author telling us why she wrote the book and what she had in mind. And then we're going to read the first 8 biographies to tell you about 8 bold women in Black history. Okay, so here we go. The first thing is the dedication from the author, Vashti Harrison. To all the women whose stories are in this book, thank you for being leaders. Thank you for being brave. Thank you for being bold. We are grateful and we are inspired. To all the leaders yet to come, big or little, I cannot wait to hear your stories. So now here's the introduction from the author. This book grew out of a project I began during Black History Month. It started as a drawing challenge to myself to illustrate one African American woman from history every day for the month of February and post the finished image to social media with a brief summary of the woman's accomplishments. As I researched and read amazing stories of women both known and unknown, I was surprised to be moved so deeply. As a Black woman, I have studied the history of my people, but never had I felt this connected to the beauty and passion behind their boldness. Whether they were fighting for their families or for social justice, or daring to become an artist or an astronaut, each one of these women broke barriers for those who came after her. In a society where being Black and female meant being an outsider or sometimes invisible, these women dared to go after what they wanted and to demand what they deserved. Some of them were reluctant leaders, while others were not even conscious of their bravery. But their legacies live on to pave the way for more of us to follow. Many of them didn't set out to be pioneers, but all of them were. And we can look to each one of them for inspiration. I wanted to tell all their stories together to celebrate not only their collective contribution to history, but also their diversity. Some of them you will recognize, such as Harriet Tubman and Rosa Parks, but you'll also meet less famous figures such as Alice Ball and Mary Bowser. You'll meet scientists, politicians, doctors, painters, sculptors, and dancers, and they are all Black women. This in no way means that this book is only for Black girls. I hope readers of every background find these stories compelling and inspiring, but I did create it with them and my younger self in mind. I think about what kind of dreams I might have had if I had known about all these women when I was growing up. If I'd known that so many people who looked like me had done such incredible things. To be able to see yourself in someone else's story can be life-changing. To know that a goal is achievable can be empowering. I hope that anyone who reads these biographies, whether or not they look like these little leaders, is inspired to go after the things they are passionate about. This collection includes only a handful of the countless bold Black women who have done extraordinary things and lived incredible lives. With these mini biographies, I hope to spark your interest and encourage you to find out more about them and the women who have followed in their footsteps. The little leaders are here to guide you on this journey through history. I originally envisioned them as little girls serving as stand-ins for these famous women. That's why they're little. But as I've started sending them out into the world, they become bigger than I imagined. I designed them to be interchangeable because I want you, the reader, to see yourself in any one of them and to feel their strength and possibility in you. With every turn of the page, you'll discover a new bold woman who changed history. Let them inspire your future. I'm excited. Okay. Our first mini biography is Phyllis Wheatley. She was born around 1753 and lived until 1784, and she was a poet. Phyllis's literary skills were apparent early on. She published her first story when she was only about 14 years old. For anyone, this would be a major feat, but Phyllis was a slave, so it was truly unique. Her original name, date of birth, and exact birthplace are all unknown. When she was only 8 years old, she was taken from her home in Africa and sold to a trader, then transported across the Atlantic to Boston, Massachusetts, aboard a ship named the Phyllis. She was then resold to a man named John Wheatley, who purchased her to be a personal servant to his wife. The Wheatleys soon recognized her intelligence and began to nurture it. They taught Phyllis everything from theology to mythology, an education that was rare for a woman and nearly unheard of for a woman of color. With the family's backing, she traveled to England to publish her first book, poems on various subjects, religious and moral. She was the first African-American woman poet ever to be published. She corresponded with George Washington and the famous French writer and philosopher Voltaire, who called her a master of English verse. Her work was so powerful that abolitionists used it as an example of the intelligence and promise of Black people. In 1767, she was emancipated. Unfortunately, she struggled financially and lived in poverty for the rest of her life. She received a great deal of praise during her lifetime, but validation from white society was integral to her success, and it never came. She continued writing, but was not able to find a publisher in America. Her natural talent and body of work live on as fundamental contributions to American literature. That's the poet Phyllis Wheatley. She was a bold woman. It's all amazing. Okay. Our next is Sojourner Truth, born around 1797, and she lived till 1883. She was an abolitionist and a women's rights advocate. Sojourner was born a slave in upstate New York under the name Isabella Baumfree. Under the state's Gradual Emancipation Act, she was due her freedom in 1827. When she realized her slave owner was planning to keep her enslaved, Sojourner ran away with her infant daughter in tow. But this came at a huge cost. She had to leave behind her 5-year-old son. The slave owner sold Sojourner's son to a plantation 1,000 miles away in Alabama. Meanwhile, Sojourner remained in hiding in New York until her freedom was official. When the coast was clear, Sojourner filed a court case saying her son had been sold illegally. She was one of the first Black women to file a court case in America, and even though it seemed nearly impossible, she won. She got her son back. In 1843, she changed her name to Sojourner, which means traveler, and became a preacher. She traveled the country sharing her messages for women's rights and the abolition of slavery everywhere. Although Sojourner could neither read nor write, her voice carried far. In December 1851, she gave a speech that she made up on the spot. In it, she advocated on behalf of Black women who faced the double discrimination of racism and sexism and had often been left out of the fight for equality. The speech is known by its most famous refrain, "Ain't I a woman?" She went on to encourage African Americans to fight on behalf of the Union in the Civil War, for former slaves to be given places to live, and for desegregation of streetcars. She was an agitator and a fierce activist for equality. Next, we have another abolitionist. We have Harriet Tubman, born 1822, died 1913. She was an abolitionist, a nurse, a scout, and a spy. One of 9 children, Harriet was born into slavery under the name Araminta Harriet Ross. Both her parents were West Africans hailing from the Ashanti warrior people. While many of her siblings were sold and traded to distant plantations, one good fortune Harriet had was to remain united with her parents throughout her youth. When she was 15, Harriet was accidentally hit in the head with an iron weight and fell into a coma for 3 days. Her brain injury resulted in narcolepsy, a permanent disorder that caused her to fall asleep at random times. Fearing her slave owner would eventually discover her injury, she decided to run away to avoid the risk of being sold or traded. After escaping to freedom in 1849, Harriet could have stayed in the North. But now that she knew it was possible to escape, she wanted to return for her family and anyone else she could rescue. Over the course of 11 years, she returned to the South 13 times and led more than 70 men, women, and children to freedom and safety via the secret system called the Underground Railroad. Known as a conductor, Harriet never lost a passenger on her journeys. Even though it was dangerous, Harriet continually put her life at risk to save others. It wasn't the last time. During the Civil War, Harriet served as an army nurse and went undercover as a spy for the North. Harriet was always looking to help other people. What very little she had, she gave away to others. She lived in poverty most of her life and donated her time, money, and property to people in need. In 2016, the U.S. Treasury announced a historic proposal to change the $20 bill. It would replace the longtime face of it, Andrew Jackson, with Harriet, making her the first woman on the front of any U.S. paper currency. We have now Rebecca Lee Crumpler. She was a physician, a doctor. She was born in 1831 and lived until 1895. From the very beginning, caring for others was a part of Rebecca's life. She was raised in Pennsylvania by her aunt, who provided healthcare services to the people in her neighborhood. Their passion for helping her community became her life's mission. She attended a private school in Massachusetts and went on to work as a nurse for 8 years. In 1860, she applied to an all-white medical school, the New England Female Medical College, a bold and risky move, but she was accepted. Rebecca graduated in 1864, becoming the first African-American woman physician in the country. Out of more than 50,000 physicians in the United States at the time, only about 300 were women, and Rebecca was the only Black woman. She began her practice in Boston, specializing in the care of women and children. But when the Civil War came to an end, she moved to Richmond, Virginia, to work with the Freedmen's Bureau. The fallen Confederate South was extremely hostile to the newly freed slaves, so Rebecca worked with the Bureau to provide health care to them. Rebecca had been born free in Delaware, the state with the highest number of free Blacks before the war. She was new to the adversity and racism of the South, but she endured it for the sake of helping the poor and needy. Throughout her career, Rebecca had a particular passion for helping women and children. In 1883, she published a 2-part text titled A Book of Medical Discourses. The first part focuses on care for infants, and the second part on women's health. It is possibly the first medical article published by a Black woman. Lost my place. Okay. Next we have Mary Bowser. She was a Civil War spy. She was born around 1840. It doesn't say how long she lived. Very little is recorded about Mary's life. What we do know is that she was born into slavery in Richmond, Virginia around 1840. She was purchased by the wealthy Van Loo family as a companion for their daughter Elizabeth. The Van Loos were no ordinary family in the South, though. They had a secret. They were Northern spies and abolitionists involved in the secret Underground Railroad. Prior to the war, when Mary was a teen, Elizabeth granted her freedom and arranged for her to receive her education in Philadelphia. Mary wanted to assist the Van Loos in their efforts against the Confederacy. At that time in the South, it was illegal for a Black person to have an education or even to read. For that reason, no one would ever suspect Mary was a threat. As a slave, she could hide in plain sight. So she agreed to go undercover as a slave in Jefferson Davis's Confederate White House. While cleaning, she would steal glances at confidential memos, and while serving dinner, she would eavesdrop on conversations between Confederate officials. She passed information about the troop movements and army plans to Elizabeth, who passed them along to Union officials. Rumor has it that Mary had a photographic memory and was able to read a page once and recite it back word for word. After the war, Mary educated freed slaves and traveled around the United States giving speeches. For a long time, she was careful to conceal her true identity using a variety of aliases. Eventually, she disappeared completely, but she is remembered. In 1995, she was inducted into the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame. That's awesome. We have another Mary, Mary Eliza Mahoney, born in 1845, and she lived until 1926. She was a nurse. Mary grew up before the American Civil War as a free woman in Massachusetts. Though, as a Black woman, her career options were limited, Mary knew that she wanted to be a nurse. When she was 18 years old, she started working at the New England Hospital for Women and Children, but she wasn't saving lives yet. She had to work as a cook and a scrubber. Although Massachusetts was the leading state in the anti-slavery movement, discrimination and segregation were still a way of life. The hospital, however, prided itself on the fact that it treated both Black and white patients. It also had a nursing program that admitted one Black student and one Jewish student per year. They considered this quite progressive. Mary worked on the hospital staff for 15 years before being admitted into the nursing program in 1878 at the age of 33. That year, 42 students were accepted, but only 4 graduated. Mary was one of them. As a private nurse, Mary had an incredible reputation as being patient and skillful. She traveled around the East Coast, and her work helped challenge racism in the South. She was soon inducted into the American Nurses Association, the ANA. In 1908, she helped support the founding of the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses, which later named a major award in her honor. Mary's nursing career lasted 43 years. She was recognized as a pioneer, and in 1976 was inducted into the ANA Nurses Hall of Fame. Her old hospital, the New England Hospital for Women and Children, renamed the DeMock Center in 2007, features a new healthcare facility named after her, Mary Mahoney Center. Oh, we have a lawyer now. We had a doctor and a nurse. Now we have a lawyer. Charlotte E. Ray was born in 1850 and lived until 1911. She was a lawyer. Charlotte's father was a minister and abolitionist newspaper editor. Her mother helped slaves escape north on the Underground Railroad. Together, they made sure that all of their 7 children had a college education. Charlotte definitely inherited the activist and proactive qualities from both her parents. As a young woman, she moved from New York City to Washington, D.C. to study at the Institution for the Education of Colored Youth. After completing her education, she began teaching at Howard University, training students to become elementary school teachers. But Charlotte had other things in mind. She applied to Howard University's all-male law school under the name C.E. Ray. The admissions committee was surprised to discover that she was a woman, but let her into the program nonetheless. She studied commercial law while still teaching. It was a demanding workload, but in 1872, she finished the program and became the first African-American woman to graduate from law school in the United States. She was only the 3rd woman of any race to complete law school in America. Many noted her skill and legal knowledge, but her gender and race prevented her from having a true shot at building a career. For several years, she attempted to establish a practice, but was unsuccessful. This setback did not stop Charlotte from making an impact. She returned to teaching, this time with young students in the public school system. She was an advocate for women's rights to vote and a delegate at the 1876 National Women's Suffrage Association. She is remembered as a pioneer, and her legacy lives on in the Charlotte E. Ray Award, given to a promising African-American woman law student every year. And our last one for today. Ida B. Wells. She was born in 1862, and she lived until 1931. She was a journalist and an activist. Ida was a natural-born activist. Wherever she saw injustice, she stood up against it. She was born a slave in Mississippi, but emancipation came to the South when she was still a child, and this meant she had the opportunity to get an education. After college, she worked as a teacher, but lost her job for criticizing the poor conditions of the Black segregated schools. In 1884, 71 years before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, Ida refused to leave her seat in the women's car on a train in Memphis, Tennessee. She had purchased a first-class ticket, but was asked to leave and join the African-American car. Ida did not go quietly. She filed a lawsuit against the railroad and eventually won her case. There was no rule that said Black women could not ride in the women's car. However, segregation legislation was soon implemented in Tennessee, and Ida received no further justice in the matter. 3 years later, her case was overturned. She took her frustrations and wrote an article in the newspaper under the name Iola, and later became known as Iola, Princess of the Press. Journalism became her outlet. She was the owner and editor of the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight, and later, the Free Speech. She took a major stance against lynching and faced death threats for her words. In 1898, she led a huge anti-lynching campaign all the way to the White House. Ida knew the power of words and knowledge and continued to use her voice to stand up for what was right. I'm looking forward to reading about more of these great, bold women next time.